In 1996, in the decaying Siberian city of Novokuznetsk, poor children began going missing from the streets. Police believed some of them might have been victims of human trafficking, but their investigations went nowhere. As spring turned into summer, a woman called the authorities, complaining about a neighbor in her apartment building. She said the man constantly played loud music on his stereo, and there was a foul, rotten stench emanating from his apartment. But no one followed up on her complaints. Later that summer, women washing their rugs in the nearby Abba River came upon a gruesome sight, a human head floating in the water. Over the next weeks, dozens of heavily decomposed heads, torsos, arms, and legs would regularly wash up on the banks of the river or turn up in a nearby vacant lot. The police thought they needed to look for a suspect that would have severe, violent mental health issues, someone who might have been institutionalized before. But thanks to a clerical error, one of Russia's worst serial killers was roaming free, and he had help from his family. Let's get into it. Hi folks, and welcome to my channel. My name is Delaney, and I'm a true crime writer and major murder nerd. I'm also recovering from pneumonia, so that's why my voice sounds like this. Sorry. On this channel, I like to talk about some of the worst people on the planet, and I tend to cuss a lot. So if you're into that sort of thing, go ahead and subscribe. If not, that's cool. You do you. But now let's get into one of the most horrific and gruesome cases to come out of Russia, that of Alexander Spesivtsev and his family. So in 1996, the Siberian town of Novokuznetsk was in decay. It was a former steel town, and its residents, like most Russians, were not benefiting from the capitalist system that had recently been rammed through after the fall of the Soviet Union. The factories and coal mines had all gone bankrupt, and most people were unemployed, or what's called underemployed, struggling to work a series of part-time and temporary jobs to try and scrape together enough money to survive. Sound familiar? With such grinding poverty and no safety net, tons of kids and teens roamed the streets. Some were homeless, some were fleeing abusive homes, and some were just left to fend for themselves while their parents worked long hours. When they first started going missing, there wasn't a lot of attention or investigation. Many people, including the police, assumed they'd just run away. But as more children and teens went missing, police did start to take notice. They went on the assumption that the missing kids might have fallen prey to human traffickers, but like I said, their investigation turned up nothing. Then, after the body parts of dozens of children began turning up, the police realized they were looking for a serial killer. They developed a profile, someone with severe, violent mental health issues who might have been institutionalized before on account of violent behaviors. So they searched the records of all the nearby mental health institutions for anyone fitting the profile who had been released and might be living in Novokuznetsk. Their search turned up nothing. If the psychiatric hospital in Oryol Oblast had kept accurate records, police would have found that one former inmate, Alexander Spesivtsev, fit the profile perfectly. He had been committed to the hospital in 1988 when he was 18 for a brutal crime. And according to the hospital's records, he was still safely in their custody. As an infant, he'd been born underweight and remained a puny, sickly kid throughout childhood. As a result, he'd been bullied by other kids. He became withdrawn and antisocial. His home life was also not great. His father was an abusive alcoholic who eventually abandoned the family, leaving Alexander's mother, Lyudmila, and his older sister, Nadezhda. The three shared a tiny one-bedroom apartment, and Alexander slept in his mother's bed until he was 12. Although he was usually quiet and withdrawn, he frequently liked pulling pranks and would engage in petty theft and vandalism. Lyudmila, his doting mother, always defended her son, either protesting his innocence or claiming some justification for his behaviors. And she shared a rather weird hobby with him. After she got a job as an assistant to a local prosecutor, Ludmila had access to graphic crime scene photos, which she would steal and bring home to share with Alexander. They even kept their favorites in a special scrapbook. During this time, it became clear Alexander was not well mentally. During his teens, he had a series of mental breakdowns requiring hospitalization. And all the while, he and his mother were obsessed with death and murder. After he was released from the mental hospital when he was 18, he moved into his own apartment at 53 Pioneersky Prospect, number 357. His mother and sister would come and visit him regularly to bring him money and food. He adopted a large Doberman, and on one of their daily walks, he met a 17-year-old named Eugenie Guznikova. They struck up a conversation and soon began dating. This was Alexander's first real relationship. At first, he showed her his romantic side, reciting poetry, taking her on long walks, and buying her flowers. She began spending most of her time at his place. Eventually, for all intents and purposes, she was living with him. But his sweet romantic facade began to fade. The two began to argue more and more, and Eugenie finally had enough. She broke up with him. This made Alexander flip his shit. Before she could leave, he attacked her and chained her to a radiator. For weeks, he kept Eugenie captive, torturing her. Finally, her mother reported her missing, and the police went to Alexander's apartment to ask about her whereabouts. Inside, they found Eugenie still alive, but covered in bruises and bed sores. She was barely able to tell police about what she'd endured before dying of sepsis from her infected wounds. Alexander was arrested and charged with her murder. He was sent to Oriol Psychiatric Hospital, where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. There, with medication and therapy, he seemed to be doing well, though his anger at the world still festered. And while he was in the hospital, he had another inmate perform surgery on him to insert a metal ball into his urethra in order to supposedly make him more virile. Needless to say, this DIY genital mutilation didn't go well. This will be important later. After only 3 years, he was released, but someone made a clerical error in his records, so it showed that he was still in the hospital. Because of this error, he was not assigned any follow-up care or supervision. In 1991, now a free man, he moved back into his apartment on Pioneersky Prospect. Besides the help from his mother, he also engaged in petty theft and stealing loose cigarettes for money. He started socializing with nearby homeless people and beggars, sharing a drink and discussing politics and philosophy with them. His favorite topic was the evils of democracy, which in his mind was one and the same with capitalism. He blamed the ills of Russian society on this democracy, and because he wasn't right in the head, he began blaming the victims of this brutal system, the homeless and unsupervised children wandering the streets. He saw them as debris that needed to be cleaned up, and he focused all of his anger and rage at them. Then in February of 1996, he met a 20-year-old woman at a train station. He convinced her to come home with him, where they later started to engage in consensual sex. However, thanks to the botched surgery that he had done when he was in the hospital, he couldn't perform. Apparently, the woman laughed at him, and that sent him into a rage. Just like he'd done with Eugenie, Alexander attacked the woman. He held her hostage for days, beating and torturing her before finally killing her. Soon afterwards, he lured a second woman to his apartment for the same treatment. Some of his neighbors later reported that they had heard screams, but with the loud music blaring and knowing Alexander had mental health issues, they thought the screams were his. In the spring of 1996, he decided to start cleaning up the streets. He came across 6 boys playing in a vacant lot and approached them with a deal. If they would help him burglarize an apartment, he would pay them with part of the proceeds. The boys agreed, and Alexander led them to his apartment. He pretended to jimmy the lock, and once the door was open, he told the boys the valuables were probably in the bedroom. Once the boys were all inside, he began stabbing them, killing them instantly. Once he'd finished them off, he piled their bodies on one side of his bedroom and just threw a cloth over them. He left them there, just a few feet away from the bed where he was sleeping, for 4 days before dragging them out into the hallway of his apartment. A week or so later, Ludmila arrived for her regular visit. You'd think seeing the bodies of 6 dead boys in her son's apartment would have freaked her out. But this was the woman who liked to collect pictures of gruesome crime scenes. She didn't scream, she didn't call the police, she didn't even try to get her son back into the psychiatric hospital. Instead, she got to work chopping up the bodies. She loaded the pieces into buckets, which she hauled down the 9 flights of stairs out to the Abba River, where she dumped them in the dead of night. From that point on, Ludmila became an important part of her son's little hobby. Soon, Alexander lured more victims to his apartment, a pair of girls, aged 12 and 14, once again by promising them a way to earn money. He continued throughout the spring and summer, luring young teens and a few adults to his apartment, where he would torture them for days before killing them. And then his mother would dispose of the bodies by chopping them up and then dumping them into the river or burying them in a vacant lot. After a while, Ludmila began taking an even greater role in her son's little hobby. As a small, elderly woman, she didn't raise any suspicions, so it was easy for her to lure people up to his apartment. As summer turned into fall, the number of missing children continued to rise. And now, in addition to the numerous body parts washing up on the banks of the Abba River, even more decomposed, dismembered human remains were found in a vacant lot near a school. They would later be determined to be the remains of 15 children between the ages of 3 and 14. But none of these body parts could be identified without DNA, and in post-Soviet Russia, DNA tests were too expensive for most police departments, especially Novokuznetsk's. And while Alexander's neighbor had called the authorities numerous times, complaining about the noise and smell coming from his apartment, her complaints were never followed up on. As the summer wore on, Alexander's bloodlust was becoming more than his mother could handle, and the bodies were piling up faster than she could dispose of them. So, in order to get rid of the remains more effectively, they began cooking them in soups and stews, which they, all 3 of them, would eat. At one point, Alexander confessed that his freezer was so full of human meat, he could barely close it. They would give the scraps to the dog along with the raw bones for him to chew on. Then, in late September, 3 more girls went missing. 15-year-old Olga Galtseva and her friends Nastya, also 15, and Zhenya, who was 13. Unlike most of the other children, these 3 weren't homeless, and their parents notified police of their disappearance immediately. Through canvassing the area, they found a shopkeeper who remembered seeing the girls the afternoon of September 24th. She said the 3 had seemed fine and happy. She also said that she saw an elderly woman approach the girls, and after speaking to them for a minute, the girls took the woman's bags and left with her. The shopkeeper described the woman as being short with dark hair. Based on the fact that the woman was shopping on foot, police figured she had to live nearby. So they began questioning nearby residents. But that was a lot of people. And Ludmila, remember, didn't actually live there. So a month after the girls disappeared, a plumber who worked at the apartments called the police. He needed to enter apartment number 357 to unclog a drain, but the resident wouldn't let him in, which was a crime. So the police went with the plumber to the apartment. The resident wouldn't open the door and just yelled at them through the door. He told them to leave and said he had mental problems and couldn't handle visitors. But the plumber needed to get inside, so the police kicked the door in. Inside, they were immediately overwhelmed by the stench of rotten flesh. The walls were covered in blood spatter. A human rib cage sat on the carpet in the living room. In the corner, Alexander's dog was chewing on a human bone. And on the couch lay a bloody girl, barely clinging to life. It was Olga. She had a broken arm and multiple stab wounds to her chest. She was immediately rushed to the hospital. As police searched the apartment more thoroughly, they found a human torso in the bathtub. Later, they would find the torso's missing head floating in the apartment building's water tank. Their search would uncover 80 pieces of bloody clothing belonging to men, women, and children, along with 40 pieces of jewelry. They also found a stash of Polaroid pictures of naked victims chained to the radiator, along with a diary written by Alexander. In it, he described killing 19 people. Alexander, meanwhile, had managed to escape out a window and onto the roof. Back at the hospital, once she could speak, Olga described something that can only be described as a fucking nightmare. She said she and her friends had agreed to help the old woman with her bags. But once they were inside the apartment, Alexander began attacking them with a knife. She said Nastya had fought back and hit him, which pissed him off so much he killed her right then. Olga and Xenia got chained to the radiator, only inches away from the body of their friend. For a month, he'd kept them prisoner, beating them, burning them with cigarettes. He had SA'd them repeatedly. He also tortured them psychologically, teasing them and making fun of them. At one point, he forced them to cut the flesh off Nastya's body and eat it. He then disemboweled Nastya's corpse in front of Olga and Xenia and flushed her intestines down the toilet, likely causing the clog that the plumber had been called to fix. He then sicked his dog on Xenia. The dog tore the girl's throat out, killing her. Alexander then forced Olga to dismember her friend's lifeless body. He then cooked her flesh in a soup which he made Olga eat. All the while, Olga said Alexander's mother and sister knew what was happening. They would come by regularly and just ignore the dead body rotting on the floor and the two naked girls chained to the radiator. They even ate some of the soup he made with Nastya's flesh. Sadly, Olga's wounds were too severe and infected. She died soon after giving her statement. Meanwhile, Alexander was still at large, but police did have Ludmila's address where they went and immediately arrested her. 3 days later, they found Alexander and arrested him too. Under interrogation, both Alexander and Ludmila confessed to their crimes. Police suspect there were as many as 80 victims based on the bloody items of clothing found at his apartment. However, Alexander recanted his confession at trial. So without the confession, the prosecutors could only link him definitively to 4 murders. He was ruled insane by the courts and sent to Kamyshin Regional Hospital, a high-security mental institution. Ludmila, as part of her confession, took police to the various sites where she'd dumped the bodies. For her crime, she was found guilty of being an accessory and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Nadezhda, though, was never charged with any crimes. Ludmila was released in 2008 after only serving 13 years. Because of their infamy, she and Nadezhda were forced to move to a rural village about 40 minutes south of Novokuznetsk. In her new home, neighbors kept her under constant surveillance, reporting her movements on social media. I tried to find out if she was still alive, but I couldn't find anything out one way or the other. Apartment 357 was locked up after police finished processing the crime scene, and it was never rented again. As for his victims, only a few of their remains were ever identified, and until DNA testing can be done, the others may never be identified. So, there you have it. If you enjoyed this terrible story, please give it a like and subscribe for more. And if you'd like to help me make more episodes like this one, as well as get early access to videos, free merch, and more, check me out on Patreon. The link is in the description. Till next time, Darklings.